Red River Valley, North Dakota. October, 1948. The wind had no enemies out here. It was a clean fighter, moving across 1,000 miles of flatness with nothing to break its stride. It scoured the topsoil in the dry months and drove the snow into impassable drifts in the winter. The farmers who chose to live here understood this wind. They built low, solid houses and heavy timber-framed barns to defy it. Their buildings were like fists clenched against the sky. And then there was Axel Johansson. What Axel was building looked less like a fist and more like a question mark. Between his two stout traditional barns, one for dairy, one for beef cattle and hay, a strange new skeleton was rising. It wasn't made of wood. It was a series of curved steel ribs, forming a long, semicircular arch that connected the main doors of the two buildings. It looked flimsy, temporary, like the carcass of some great metallic beast that had washed ashore on this sea of prairie grass. His neighbors watched from the beds of their pickup trucks, leaning on fences with cups of coffee, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. This was the talk of the county. "What in God's name is the Norwegian building now?" muttered Jebediah Miller to anyone who would listen. "Looks like he's trying to build a culvert to the sky." The most vocal critic was Silas Croft. Silas was a man whose family had farmed this land for 3 generations. He was the unofficial arbiter of what was proper and what was foolish. He built his barns with hand-hewn oak beams and a plumb line, and they stood as straight and true as his rigid convictions. He drove his Ford 8N tractor over to Axel's fence line, shut off the engine, and folded his thick arms over his chest. Axel was on a ladder, wrestling a sheet of corrugated steel into place on the curved frame. "Johansson." Silas's voice carried easily on the wind. Axel paused, looking down. "That flimsy tin half-pipe will catch the north wind and tear right off before you've even paid for it," Silas declared, his voice full of the authority of experience. "A proper breezeway needs heavy posts and a pitched roof to shed the snow. You're wasting good money on a wind trap that'll collapse by Christmas. It's the damnedest, most foolish thing I've ever seen built on this soil." Axel Johansson simply looked at the structure, then back at Silas. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. "She'll hold," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the wind. Then he turned back to his work, leaving Silas to shake his head and drive away, certain he had just witnessed a man building his own failure. The mockery was constant, but the work continued. What did this Norwegian shipwright, a man who understood the complex curves of a hull, meant to withstand the crushing pressure of the North Atlantic, understand about radiant heat and convective loops that a lifetime of prairie farming had missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of these frontier innovators, the ones who saw the world differently and, in doing so, created solutions that were decades ahead of their time. If you believe in the power of practical genius, consider subscribing and liking this video. I promise that by the end of this story, you will learn how a herd of ordinary farm animals can be turned into a silent, fuel-free furnace capable of heating a building through the worst of a Dakota winter. Let us know in the comments, what's the most ingenious, unconventional solution you've ever seen for a common farm problem? Axel Johansson was not a farmer by trade. He was a man of the sea, born and raised in the port city of Bergen, Norway. His hands were not trained to the plow, but to the adze and the steam box. He was a shipwright. For 20 years, he had built fishing trawlers, vessels designed to wrestle a living from the cruelest waters on earth. He didn't think in terms of posts and beams. He thought in terms of ribs and skins. He understood that strength often came not from mass, but from shape. A curved hull, properly braced, could distribute the immense, chaotic pressure of a rogue wave across its entire structure, turning a fatal blow into a manageable force. A straight wall, by contrast, met that same force head-on, and if it was not massive enough, it would break. He brought this knowledge, and his wife Solveig, and their 2 children, Lars and Astrid, to North Dakota in 1946. They sought land, space, a future they could build with their own hands. They bought a quarter section of good, black soil, and a farmstead with a sturdy house and 2 decent barns, separated by 50 yards of open ground. Their first winter, in 1947, was a lesson in humility taught by the wind. The 50 yards between the house and the barns became a frozen no-man's land. Every trip to milk the cows or feed the cattle was a brutal, life-threatening expedition. The wind drove ice crystals into their eyes and stole the breath from their lungs. One morning, carrying 2 heavy pails of water to the herd, Solveig slipped on a patch of ice. The water splashed, and before she could even get up, her thick woolen mittens had frozen solid to the metal handles. Axel had to carefully chip them free. The skin on her palms was a raw, angry red for weeks, a mild case of frostbite that could have been much worse. Young Lars, only 9 at the time, developed a deep, rattling cough that winter that settled in his chest for a month, a consequence of the constant shock of moving between the warm house and the biting cold. They lost 2 newborn calves, not to disease but simply to the penetrating chill that even the barn walls couldn't fully stop. That winter wasn't just hard, it was a siege. The enemy wasn't the snow or the cold. The enemy was the wind-blasted space between things. The conventional wisdom of the prairie was to build separate, specialized structures. A house for living, a barn for dairy, another for equipment or hay. Each building was an island, a fortress against the elements. But this philosophy had a fundamental flaw, one that Axel, with his shipwright's mind, saw clearly. The weak point in any fleet of ships is the open water between them, and the weak point of the prairie farm was the open yard between the buildings. Every time a farmer stepped outside, he was a massive source of heat loss. The 98.6-degree human body would be assaulted by air that was often 120 degrees colder. The body would fight back, burning calories, food, energy, just to stay alive. The same was true for the farmhouse. Every time the door opened, a plume of precious, expensive heat, generated by burning cords of wood or tons of coal, would rush out, replaced by a killing draft of cold air. The barns themselves were thermodynamic failures. Men like Silas Croft built them to be strong, not warm. They were vast, single-walled structures, full of gaps and drafts. The immense body heat generated by the animals, a living, breathing furnace, simply rose to the high ceilings and leaked out through the roof and walls. Farmers would run small stoves in the barns, not to keep the animals warm, but merely to keep the water troughs from freezing into solid blocks of ice. They were engaged in a constant, losing battle against entropy, throwing fuel and feed at a problem that was architectural in nature. The livestock shivered in their stalls, burning the calories from their feed just to maintain their core temperature, calories that were therefore not converted into milk or meat. The system was profoundly inefficient, a fact accepted as an unavoidable cost of doing business in a cold climate. Axel saw it not as a cost, but as a design failure. The problem wasn't the cold. The problem was the container. So in the autumn of 1948, Axel began to build his solution. He didn't tear down the old barns. He decided to connect them. He started by pouring 2 long, parallel concrete footers stretching the 60 feet from the wide doorway of the dairy barn to the matching doorway of the hay barn. The footers were 12 feet apart, creating the foundation for a wide, enclosed walkway. His materials were unconventional. He'd driven to a military surplus yard in Fargo and purchased a stack of curved corrugated steel ribs from a dismantled Quonset hut for $150, a significant sum for him. These huts, a common sight after the war, were known for being cheap and fast to erect, but also for being cold in the winter and hot in the summer. No one used them for anything more than equipment storage. As he bolted the steel ribs to the footers, the shape of his strange vision began to emerge. Silas Croft, Jebediah Miller, and another neighbor, Gus Thompson, would often stop by. They'd watch him work, shaking their heads. "The snow load's gonna flatten that thing, Axel," Gus offered, trying to be helpful. "A curved roof holds the snow. A peaked roof sheds it. It's simple geometry." Axel, tightening a bolt, just nodded. "The curve is strong," was all he said. Silas was less gentle. "You're putting a sail up between your barns, man. When we get a real nor'wester, it's going to lift that whole tin can and dump it in the next county. You need cross-bracing, you need heavy timbers. This is sheet metal and hope." Axel's response was always the same, calm and quiet. "She'll hold." He methodically attached the outer skin of corrugated steel sheets to the ribs. Then came the part that truly baffled his neighbors. He began building a second, inner wall, attaching another layer of steel to the inside of the ribs. This created a 6-inch cavity running the entire length and breadth of the structure. His wife, Solveig, watched him with a curious smile. "It looks like a great silver worm, Axel," she said one afternoon, bringing him a glass of water. He smiled back, a rare, full grin. "A warm worm, I hope," he replied. Into this 6-inch gap, he and Lars spent days packing a mixture of dry straw and sawdust from a local mill. It was cheap, abundant, and, as Axel knew, a remarkably effective insulator. Air trapped within the fibrous material could not move, preventing heat from conducting through the walls. He was building an insulated cocoon. He framed in the ends of the tunnel, creating heavy, insulated doors that led to the outside, and left the barn-facing ends completely open. Finally, he cut rectangular openings into the south-facing side of the arch, and fitted them with panes of salvaged acrylic, creating simple, double-paned windows to let in the winter sun. The project took him 6 weeks and cost him nearly $200, the entirety of their savings. To his neighbors, it was a monumental folly. To Axel, it was an investment in survival. What Axel understood was a simple, powerful set of physical laws that his neighbors, for all their practical experience, had never harnessed. The core of his design relied on 2 principles: radiant heat and natural convection. First, radiant heat. Every warm body emits thermal energy in the form of infrared radiation. A human being at rest radiates about the same heat as a 100-watt light bulb. A 1,200-pound dairy cow, with its massive metabolism and large surface area, is a biological furnace. It radiates on average 3,000 British thermal units, or BTUs, of heat per hour. That is the equivalent of a small electric space heater running continuously. Axel had 20 Holstein cows in his dairy barn and another 15 Hereford cattle in the other. Combined, his herd was a living power plant, generating over 100,000 BTUs of waste heat every single hour, day and night. That was enough energy to heat a large house. In a conventional barn, this precious energy was utterly wasted. The warm air produced by the animals' bodies and breath would rise, collecting at the peak of the high roof, and then bleed out through countless cracks, vents, and uninsulated surfaces. The farmers were heating the sky. Axel's tunnel was, in essence, a massive heat trap. By leaving the main doors of both barns wide open into the tunnel, he allowed this cloud of waste heat to flow out of the barns and into the connecting structure. This is where the second principle, convection, came into play. Warm air is less dense than cold air, so it naturally rises. In a square building, this leads to stratification, a hot layer at the ceiling and a cold layer at the floor. But the semicircular shape of the Quonset arch, the very feature his neighbors mocked, was crucial. It created a perfect, gentle, convective loop. The warm air would rise from the animals, flow into the peak of the tunnel's arch, and then, as it moved along the insulated curve, it would cool slightly, become denser, and sink down the other side, pushing the cooler air at the bottom back towards the barns to be warmed again by the animals. This constant, slow circulation distributed the heat evenly throughout the entire 720-square-foot space, preventing cold spots and drafts. The insulation was the final critical piece. The 6 inches of packed straw and sawdust gave the walls an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, far superior to the solid wood walls of his neighbors' barns. The heat generated inside the tunnel stayed inside. The double-paned acrylic windows on the south side added another ingenious layer: passive solar gain. On any clear winter day, the low-angled sun would stream through, adding its own heat to the system, while the double glazing minimized the amount of heat that could escape back out. Axel hadn't just built a walkway. He had built a passive heat recovery and circulation system. It was a closed loop, a self-regulating environment powered entirely by the metabolic processes of his own livestock. He had turned his 2 separate, inefficient barns into a single, high-performance ecosystem. That November, the winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invading army. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. The first snows came, and then the wind began its relentless assault. By mid-December, the Red River Valley was in the grip of a brutal cold snap. The radio warned of an approaching blizzard, a true Dakota ground blizzard, where the wind was so strong it picked up the fallen snow and created whiteout conditions even without new precipitation. The storm hit on a Tuesday. By noon, visibility was 0. The world outside the windows was a churning, roaring vortex of white. The temperature fell to 20 degrees below 0, but the wind, gusting to 50 miles per hour, created a wind chill of more than 40 below, a temperature at which exposed skin would freeze in minutes. On the Croft farm, life ground to a halt. Silas and his wife were prisoners in their own home. He had to bundle himself in every layer he owned just to make the perilous journey to his barn, fighting the wind for every step, a rope tied between the house and the barn door his only guide. Inside the barn, the air was frigid. His cattle were huddled together, their backs covered in a fine layer of frost from their own frozen breath. He worked frantically, his fingers numb even inside his gloves, breaking the thick ice in the water trough and throwing down extra hay, knowing the animals were burning through it just to stay alive. He worried constantly about the roof of the older barn, groaning under the weight of a massive drift the wind had piled against its side. On the Johansson farm, the scene was from another world. The blizzard raged outside their walls, but inside, a strange and wonderful peace reigned. In the morning, Axel, Solveig, Lars, and Astrid put on their coats and boots and walked the short, sheltered path from their house to the heavy door at the end of the tunnel. The moment they stepped inside and closed the door behind them, the storm vanished. The roaring wind was replaced by a profound, muffled silence. The air was still. It was not warm like the house, but it was not cold. It was a calm, stable coolness. A thermometer Axel had nailed to one of the wooden support posts read 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Lars and Astrid unbuttoned their coats. Solveig set to work, moving from the dairy barn to the hay barn with an easy, unhurried gait. She milked the cows, her hands nimble and warm. The animals were placid, comfortable, chewing their cud without a hint of stress. The water in their troughs was cool and clear. In the middle of the tunnel, under the light of the acrylic windows, Solveig had set up a small workbench. She sat on a stool, calmly mending a leather harness, the air filled with the clean, living smells of hay and livestock. The children, their chores done, played a game of catch in the long open space, their laughter echoing softly in the great silver tube. Lars wore only his flannel shirt, not a parka, a shirt. The family was not just surviving the storm, they were living through it, untouched, in a bubble of warmth they had created themselves. For 2 days, the blizzard howled. On the third morning, the wind finally began to subside. Inside the Croft barn, Silas heard a sound that turned his blood to ice, a sharp, splintering crack, followed by a deep groan of tortured wood. He scrambled to the far end of the barn just as a 20-foot section of the roof gave way under the immense weight of the snowdrift. A cascade of snow, ice, and splintered timbers crashed down, narrowly missing his prize-winning Hereford bull, a magnificent animal worth a small fortune. The bull was terrified but unharmed, trapped in its now exposed stall. Snow was beginning to pour into the barn. Silas knew he had to move the animal to his second, sturdier barn, some 40 yards away. But when he forced the door open, his heart sank. The path was gone. In its place was a solid wall of snow, a drift piled 8 feet high by the storm. It was impassable. Tunneling through would take hours, and with the roof compromised, he didn't have hours. He was trapped. His most valuable animal was in danger, and he was helpless. Through the swirling snow, he saw a faint, steady light. It was from Axel Johansson's place. Swallowing a lump of pride so large it felt like a stone in his throat, Silas began the grueling trek across the field. The snow was waist-deep, and the wind still cut like a razor. It took him 20 minutes to cover the 100 yards. He pounded on Axel's door, his face raw, his clothes caked in ice. When Axel opened it, Silas didn't waste time with pleasantries. His words came out in ragged, desperate puffs of steam. "Axel, I need your help. My roof, the bull, the drift. I can't get him out." Axel looked at the exhausted, desperate man. He saw not the arrogant critic, but a neighbor in trouble. He simply nodded. "We'll bring him through my place," he said. He led Silas not towards his own barns, but to the heavy wooden door at the end of the long, curved structure. Silas braced himself for another blast of wind as Axel pulled the door open, and then the world changed. He stepped out of the screaming, blinding white chaos and into the tunnel. The sound cut off as if a switch had been thrown. The wind vanished. He was enveloped in an atmosphere of absolute, shocking stillness. It was not a wave of heat that hit him, not like the blast from a stove. It was an envelope of stable, deep, silent warmth. He stood there for a moment, stunned. He automatically pulled off his ice-caked mittens, his frozen fingers beginning to ache as they thawed. He looked down the long, 60-foot passage, dimly lit by the windows and a few bare bulbs. He saw the cattle moving calmly in the barn at the far end. He saw Solveig watching him, her expression one of quiet empathy, with no hint of, "I told you so." His eyes fell on the thermometer nailed to a post. The mercury clearly read 55 degrees. 55. It was likely 20 below outside, with a wind chill making it feel like 40 below. Here inside this flimsy tin can, it was 95 degrees warmer and perfectly still. He reached out and touched the insulated interior wall. He expected the biting cold of metal. Instead, the painted steel was neutral, almost warm to the touch. They led Silas's massive bull from the pasture into Axel's hay barn, through the wide-open doorway, into the tunnel, along the concrete floor, and into the dairy barn on the other side. The animal, already spooked, seemed to calm down in the peaceful environment. From there, it was a short, manageable walk to Silas's undamaged barn. As they secured the bull in its new stall, Silas Croft was silent. He walked back with Axel and stopped at the threshold of the tunnel, looking back down its impossible length. The space was alive with the quiet sounds of contentment, the soft lowing of cattle, the rustle of hay. He thought of his own collapsed roof, his shivering animals, the cords of wood he had burned to fight a battle he was doomed to lose. He looked at what this quiet Norwegian had built, not with brute force, but with intelligence. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "My God, Axel," he said, shaking his head in slow wonder. "You didn't build a walkway. You built a river of warmth." Silas Croft, the loudest critic, became Axel Johansson's most fervent advocate. He told the story to anyone who would listen. At the feed store, at church, at the local cooperative meeting. He didn't just admit he was wrong. He preached the gospel of the Johansson passage. He explained how he had walked through it in his shirt sleeves in the middle of a blizzard, how the animals were calm and healthy, how Axel's children could do their chores without fear of frostbite. The story eventually reached the ears of a writer for the Red River Farmers Union Herald, a monthly newsletter that was essential reading for every farmer in the region. Intrigued, the writer drove out to the Johansson farm. He spent an entire day with Axel, taking measurements, sketching diagrams, and listening intently as the shipwright explained the principles of radiant heat, insulation, and convective loops in simple, direct terms. 2 weeks later, the feature article appeared. It was titled, "The Johansson Passage: Turning Livestock into Furnaces." The article was a sensation. It laid out the science in a way any farmer could understand, calculating the BTU output of a typical herd and showing, with clear diagrams, how the curved insulated structure captured and circulated that free energy. It detailed Axel's low-cost, surplus materials and his use of straw for insulation. It was a blueprint for a revolution. The spread of the idea was rapid. The frontier had always rewarded what worked, and the Johansson passage clearly worked. By the spring of 1949, 7 farms in Cass County had built their own variations, some with wood frames, others with different insulating materials, but all based on the same core principles. By the winter of 1950, there were over 24 across North Dakota and into Minnesota. The reports that came back were unanimous: fuel savings of up to 50%, a dramatic increase in milk production during the winter months, and healthier, more productive livestock. What Axel Johansson had created using salvaged materials and the intuition of his old-world trade was decades ahead of its time. He had built a structure that today's architects would recognize as a marvel of efficiency. They would use terms like passive solar design, bioheating, and integrated thermal envelope. Axel, the quiet shipwright, had no such vocabulary. He was simply solving a problem: how to protect his family from the 50 yards of killing wind that separated his home from his livelihood. He had built a better, smarter container. The great myth of the prairie was one of rugged individualism. It preached a gospel of independence, of standing alone against the elements. Each farm was a kingdom, each building a fortress with high, straight walls. Success was measured by how strong your walls were, how much hardship you could endure on your own. Axel Johansson's strange, curved tunnel offered a different sermon. Its genius was not in the strength of its individual parts, but in the power of their connection. By bridging the gap between his 2 barns, he made both of them stronger, warmer, and more productive. He created a system where the buildings, the animals, and the people all worked in concert, each contributing to the welfare of the whole. He saw the waste heat of his cattle not as a problem to be vented, but as a resource to be captured and shared. The lesson of the Johansson passage was not about building a better wall to keep the winter out. It was about building a smarter bridge to bring life together. It was a quiet testament, written in steel and straw against the Dakota sky, that the most resilient systems are not the ones that are the most isolated, but the ones that are the most ingeniously interconnected. If you found this story of frontier ingenuity as powerful as we did, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and like this video. It helps us to continue to find and share these incredible tales of practical wisdom. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What other examples of passive heating or clever, low-tech solutions have you seen or heard about? The reconstructions and events depicted in this video are inspired by historical accounts and building practices for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized. The application of any historical building technique in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.